Recovery from Anything features real stories that some listeners might find distressing. Check the show notes for specific content warnings and information on support services.
I was kind of just existing. I was just going through the motions. I had all these feelings inside, but I buried them deep down. I remember even sometimes when they were bubbling to the surface, I'd just sort of sit and just try and force it down, push them down really deep down so I wouldn't feel anything. Kids sense weakness. They're going to come down on that like a ton of bricks, and they did.
Welcome to Recovery from Anything. I'm your host, Abby Feltham. As kids, many of us have felt the sting of being outsiders, of not quite fitting in. Whether it was interests that set us apart, or simply the uniqueness that makes us who we are, the experience of feeling different is universal. But what happens when this innocent feeling of not belonging turns into a relentless battle with bullying? Although I wasn't bullied as a child, I certainly felt disconnected from my classmates. They all seemed to be interacting in a world of homework, lunch tables, and after-school clubs, where I was an angry kid, resentful. There was a darkness inside me that not even I understood. So how could I even begin to understand them? I wouldn't verbalise this, of course. I didn't know how. Instead, I masked my feelings of isolation and pretended to be a normal kid. It was exhausting playing this character, but I played the part well. However, it made me grapple with a sense of not knowing where I fit in or who I truly was. Until I had a fantastic idea that I definitely would never ever regret years later and started drinking. The only time I felt like I could relate to other kids was when I was drunk. And so I just stayed drunk. Gold star for teenage me. 10 out of 10, go to the top of the class. Today's storyteller not only had those feelings of being an outsider, he also had to endure years of his peers taunting him for it. But when the school year ended and the days of teachers and classes and homework left him, the wounds inflicted during his formative years never did. Here's Luke Chaplin.
I was always a shy, awkward kid, a bit oversensitive, not very confident at all. I remember just being by myself a lot of the time, not really having many friends, occasionally getting beaten up, and that was just my routine. It was a pretty lonely start to life, really. When I was about 9 or 10, we moved over to America. My dad worked in the car industry, so we moved to Detroit, Motor City, which was pretty scary, actually. I was at the age where I was old enough to know it was a big thing. While that was kind of interesting and potentially exciting to a 9-year-old kid who was just being wrenched away from home, it was terrifying. I remember actually crying quite badly on the night they told me they're having a bit of a breakdown, and my younger brothers were like, what's the problem? I think it was a bit easier because they're a bit younger. I know that they had their own issues, but it always feels like they had a better time of it than me. It always seems to be the oldest and the youngest that generally get it the hardest, and being the oldest, that was definitely the case for me. I'd keep to myself even within the family. I wouldn't spend too much time with my other 3 brothers. I didn't feel like I had much in common with them. They seemed to have a better connection with my parents than I did, all of them. It was difficult sometimes to get involved. They were more sporty than I was. I wasn't very sporty. I did try and do some of the sports teams over there in the States, but again, I was always a bit uncoordinated, not really into them as much. So again, not having anything in common to latch onto, like being the weird kind of guy in the corner who likes sci-fi and tech and things. you kind of, they're kind of slightly solitary activities, especially at that age. They're not so much now with the internet and all different cultures out there. But back then, no. My dad, he buried himself in work, and he was just never present. He's not a bad guy, but he just was never there. he said it a few times actually, and quite proudly, and it was bizarre when he told me this, that he preferred sort of going into work and not dealing with the family. He'd sometimes sleep at the office. He just couldn't cope, especially with some of the things that were going on with me. He'd take the American long working hours culture as an excuse to not be at home, which I think affected everyone. It affected my mum, but just my relationship between her and my dad, it was always strained. I always feel like, I still feel this to this day, like a bit of a black sheep of the family. It was a bit of a difficult time over there for me, to be honest. Like I'd been bullied before we moved to the States, and that's probably actually, I would say, where a lot of my troubles began. I was a bullied kid basically all the way through my childhood, which wasn't ideal. Obviously, moving to northern Midwest area of America, not many tourists around there, like on the East or West Coast, and just being bullied because of being other, really, which, you know, what was essentially it. I was just a weird, exotic kid with a strange, funny accent. I was a bit oversensitive as a child as well. I don't think that helped, so I probably reacted quite badly to things, but some horrible experiences over there, really, unfortunately. I do like Americans. I have worked with them since in my working life, so I don't hold it against them, but school can be tough, and that was definitely a bit of a bleak time. Not only was the bullying over there so intense, like there was some really humiliating things they did, like pinned me down quite a few times, cornered me, hated my chair, so I sat down and got it all over my bum, stood up, everyone laughing at me in class, and the school not really doing much. This is how insane it was over there. I went to a Catholic school in America run by Dominican nuns from Alabama. So that was about as ultra religious as you could get. So they were all about this turning the other cheek thing. But looking back, they were just protecting their own. That sort of thing added to it, because there was no support from the school or the teachers. Like, my parents did try, bless them, but they were out of their depth. They were in another country. They were struggling with their own setup over there, as well as having one of their kids just losing his mind constantly, and like I remember running out of school a couple of times just to get away and having to be picked up and being brought back, which was even more humiliating, but I just couldn't cope. At the time, obviously, you don't have the emotional vocabulary to describe it. I would say now I was kind of just existing. I was just going through the motions. I had all these feelings inside, but I buried them deep down. I remember even sometimes when they were bubbling to the surface, I'd just sort of sit and just try and force it down, push them down really deep down, so I wouldn't feel anything. I'd try and make myself numb, and that did get me through for a while, but obviously that came back later in life with a vengeance. It is not a very healthy coping strategy at all. But there was nothing else out there. There was nothing else anyone could suggest. Schools weren't equipped to deal with it. I would say they're probably slightly more equipped to deal with it now, but there's just more awareness. Whether or not they can actually help is another matter. And then we moved back just early 2000s to the UK and back into secondary school over here.
Were you relieved when you found out you were going to go back to the UK?
I was, yes. I was really hopeful when we came back. I thought things would be different. But the cycle started again, and this time it was because I sounded a bit funny coming back. I'd picked up a bit of a transatlantic accent. My mannerisms were slightly different. Again, it's just cultural things that fed into it, and that was the same over there. Like, my accent was different, but also culturally was Britain and America actually can be quite different depending on what part of the country you're in. And the part of the country we were in, we were very different. And again, coming back, it was the same thing. I'd missed out on like lots of just stuff around pop culture as well, like the Spice Girls. I'd sort of missed that thing. I was like, what was that about? The bullying, it continued for a few years. Things got pretty dark pretty quickly. When I was 14, it was when I attempted to take my own life for the first time. It'd been a couple of weeks of just quite intense but low-level bullying at school, just people making lots of comments, shutting me like in the playground during break, and it always went through cycles, peaks and troughs. This is obviously a peak at this point. It wasn't the biggest peak, but it was definitely a peak. Been shoved around a bit, been roughed up once or twice, and this is when like the cap I'd put on all those feelings to try and push them down started to slip. I couldn't keep it down anymore. I could feel it losing it slightly, losing control, and I just wanted to lash out at people. But again, I was stopping myself even feeling anger because I was worried about getting in trouble. So I'd like run off somewhere and just kind of scream somewhere where no one could hear me. And a couple of friends who I thought were my friends had come round to visit, and we'd been out walking around, just hanging around like kids do, just at the park and things. And they just started kicking off some really slightly sinister teasing, just picking on like some of my mannerisms and why was I so weird. And I just remember just snapping and just, that was it. I just walked off. And like, I even remember some of it, even though it's slightly out of body, I didn't react to them or talk to them. I went into a sort of robot mode and like just spotted a busy street not far from my house. And I knew there was some like a sharp bend where people couldn't see anything as they came around it at speed. And I just walked towards it. And the other kids, I think, realized eventually what was happening, and they had to physically jump on me and hold me down. There was a stage where I was just sort of standing at the edge of the curb, just zoned out. They couldn't get through to me, and they realized what I was about to do. And I started to take a step. I remember actually taking a step out and then just getting side tackled. And I remember fighting them so hard. That was it. Everything was out then. Like, all my feelings exploded. I was swearing, like really physically going for it, like trying to attack them. I'd never felt that strong before, which sounds so weird now. Like, they really struggled to keep me down. I don't think they realized I had that in me. I didn't realize I had that in me. But eventually, obviously, I managed to get free and run, and I tried to go for another road. And again, they had to catch me and pin me down physically. It was so bizarre, like just in the middle of this housing estate, all this chaos going on, like no adults came out or anybody to react to it. There was people around. It was so strange thinking about it now that there was nobody came over to see what was going on. Eventually, I just physically couldn't keep them off me anymore, and I did give up, and I just kind of slumped and just went deathly quiet again. They didn't know what to do, so they took me home to my mum. They knocked on the door. She opened it. She could see something was wrong, and they just had to tell her what happened. And I just immediately just broke down crying. She took me in. She said, "Thanks, boys," and like sent them off. I kind of blacked out after that. I think I just fell asleep for like hours and hours. And in that time, I believe my mum had tried to speak to the GP about it, managed to get hold of them on an emergency line. And that's when she asked me, "I think you need to talk to someone about this." And I'd come back to my senses a bit more, but I said to her, "No, I did not want this coming out. I did not want to talk about it with anyone." I was obviously going straight back into denial mode about it. And evidently, like a few weeks later, I tried to hang myself and put the cable around my neck. And I was going to jump a step off, like we had some bunk beds in my room. So I was going to step off the top of the ladder. And like, I kind of came off, slipped down. It was about to take my weight, and I kind of grabbed it and stopped. And obviously, I still had that survival instinct kicking in, but I was trying to G myself up to override that, and I couldn't. I felt embarrassed. I felt silly. Like, it wasn't even sadness or depression. I felt it was just shame. Not that I attempted it per se, but I couldn't follow through with it, and it made me feel like I'm no good at life. I can't even try. I can't even do dead right. And I think some of it was because I felt like I hadn't wanted it enough. That was awful. It was more of a cry for help. But again, I felt kind of weak in myself that I hadn't wanted it enough to do it properly.
I completely relate. All the things I've been through in my life, I've never felt more shame than after suicide attempts. I tried to hang myself in 2020 before the pandemic, and obviously it was not successful. But I have never, after that, I've never felt shame like that before. Like, and since, like, it's so intense. I think it's just coming, because it comes at you from all directions. It's like, embarrassment, self-hatred, failure, all those things together. And it's just a shame bomb.
It is, and it's failure, I think, is the biggest one, because you felt a failure, so that's why you've attempted to take your life, because it's like, I'm a failure at existing, at being alive, ergo I should not be here anymore. And then when you can't do it, you feel even more of a failure because you've not had the guts to do it. After those two attempts, I just completely I kind of shut that part of me away and acted like a normal human being for like the rest of my teens and my 20s by just going into deep denial. So I just put on a mask. I just ignored it. I ignored it. I managed to meet my wife. I got married. I mean, I was doing everything right. We lived on a canal boat for like 6 years. We had a really awesome time doing that. Like, we moved up to Manchester, bought a house. I mean, everything should be on paper be fine, but it wasn't, because when I hit 30 and we moved out of London to Birmingham, because my wife Katie, she's a doctor, she got her training post up here and we had to move. I had to leave my job at the time. Triggered for the first time in a long time feelings of instability, which I hadn't felt since I was a kid, and had no plan. I'd always had a job up to that point, including a paper round, or worked in Saturday jobs, you're working in shops even during university. And I struggled to find work for a while for the first time in my life, because I had to maybe potentially look at something different from what I was doing before. This was obviously before remote working. And I had a good few months of being alone with my thoughts for most of the day, with no plan or structure. And that's what had been keeping me going for all those years, having a plan and structure. And once that was taken away, I had no resilience. I had nothing there. And I didn't even realize at this point how I'd stopped suppressing it. It'd just been kind of a dormant part of me. And all of a sudden it was there. It started off with some issues around me trying to find work, and led to pressure with our marriage. I just started feeling useless and shame again, because I didn't have a job. I wasn't helping with the bills at that point. I felt very exposed. I realized I was eating to my savings to help out where I could. And I started panicking because I didn't know what to do and how to make this better. I couldn't figure out a way out. I'd maybe do fits and starts trying to find work, and then I'd be totally demotivated and lie in bed all day. I got very, very depressed, and felt that for the first time since I was a kid. Again, just feeling a failure because I've not managed to do the basics of holding down a job or like find something straight away. I think I gave myself a bit too much of a hard time with that. And then it spiraled into something which was like, oh, just a period of not being employed, to this is the worst thing ever, and my wife's going to leave me, and I'm a failure because I don't have a job, and that was my structure and that was my routine that helped me act like a normal human being.
Over the course of a few weeks, Luke began to have panic attacks. Then he started blacking out, finding himself in fugue states where he would regain consciousness in locations he didn't remember getting to. Until one day, he found himself by the road again, contemplating the oncoming traffic.
I don't even remember walking to the road, which I instantly connected with my first attempt when I was younger. We ended up going to the emergency GP, who just took one look at me and he said, I'm putting her on medication straight away. There was not even a discussion. I managed to string together a few sentences. My wife filled in the rest, and he shoved a prescription my way straight away. And we got myself sorted with some, initially some CBT therapy, 6 sessions. Unfortunately, it's not that much, but it helped and it stabilized me. And by that stage, I'd managed to find some work, and that kept me going for a few months. And then that led actually to a better job, which again gave me that ultimate structure that I was missing. And my mental health seemed to stabilize at that point. I had a really good 3 years in a job I really enjoyed, but it was all an illusion because I hadn't dealt with it properly. I'd just taken some medication, but not had therapy, because I didn't know enough about treatments, about how you actually have to look after your own brain to realize that there's more to it than just, oh, you've gone through the initial crisis, you're okay now, we've got you stable, you can go back to your life. That's not how it works. And so that led to, after a couple of years, another series when COVID hit of what I call the really dark times, where I ended up jumping between a couple of jobs because I couldn't hold a job down properly, because I'd throw myself into environments which were either toxic or had horrific work-life balance, which involved like dealing with things at all sorts of the night, dealing with calls like to the other side of the world. Even when I asked for help to cut my workload down, there was no support there. It was terrible. And I realized I was doing that to try and get structure back. I was going into these quite bad work environments as a way of trying to validate myself. And I also realized I was doing what my dad did when he was younger. He found validation through work and working himself to death at all hours and not dealing with his feelings or emotions. And I'd realized I'd imprinted on that. I'd taken that and applied it to myself. I ended up going through a cycle of coming onto medication, coming off it, not really dealing with anything. I did have some therapy for a couple of years in between this when I was stable, which did help. But as soon as I stopped that, things backslid. Again, I hadn't learned the lesson that good mental health is work. You have to maintain it. There's no way around that. You just have to maintain it. So this all led to a massive crescendo around July, August 2021. This was like the latest job I got into, a quite bad agency environment. And I crumbled within 6 weeks. They put me on quite challenging assignments because of my previous experience. My CV, like on paper, looked great, but the flip side to that is you get on all the really challenging work because they think you can handle it. And obviously I couldn't. I dabbled with a bit of self-harm at this stage, which is something I hadn't done before. So this is another new thing coming in on top of everything else. The scary thing with that one was how good it was at helping me cope with things. I was just focusing on the pain that was giving me at the time, and it took the actual pain away, which was scary. I don't know how I didn't do more of that. I was starting to spiral. I ended up attempting an overdose. Like I got together a bunch of drugs. I had this big pile in front of me, and I was just about to go on another work call in between doing this. I was kind of like, oh, I'll just take this and then I'll like do the thing. Like I'm not giving anything away. No one knows I'm going to do this. I just written a very ridiculous but embarrassing goodbye cruel world suicide note, which started off because I didn't want to be a dickhead with all the life admin stuff, so my wife wouldn't have to worry about that. Because I was like, no, I know deaths and funerals are a big deal, so here's all the logins for everything and all the bank accounts and the Netflix, so you'll be fine. And then I did all the goodbye cruel world stuff underneath. I'd spent all day trying to get my affairs in order. But again, that's why I knew it was serious, because I was actually planning for me not being there. And then I ended up on this call with a work colleague, and I just suddenly just collapsed and said what I was about to do. He kind of obviously freaked out. This was like still pandemic times on a Zoom call like this. And you have someone saying, oh, I'm just about to kill myself. Like, sorry, how's your day going? And he obviously came off that call, told my boss immediately. She took me off work straight away, and I didn't go back because I couldn't, but I was signed off initially for a period of a few months where I just had to recover properly. Obviously, my wife came back, found out what had happened. Like the mental health crisis team started coming in. I didn't end up in hospital. I was assessed by a psychiatrist for that, but because of the state of the NHS and how things were at the time with COVID, they decided to manage me in the community. That effectively meant I was checked on. I was just being under regular observation every 24, 48 hours with people checking on me, coming around to make sure I didn't do anything, which was, again, the shame and embarrassment of that, but also people noticing in the street and our neighbours, doctors and nurses coming out of the house on a regular basis every other day and wondering what was going on there. I think I'd bottomed out completely. I had no hope. The only thing about the bottom is the only way is up. There is only one direction to go after that. There isn't a sub-basement. I was already in the sub-basement. And it was the first time I was just there properly thinking about what I needed from life and what I wanted from life to actually still want to be here for. I'd realised I didn't want to leave my wife. I am acting in a very, very damaging way to other people, not just myself. And I think that's when I was able to realize that if I provide some validation for myself, then I can provide validation to other people, and like I can try and be a better person. It took a while to come to that realization, and I had to think that I was actually worth something. During that time, I took the time to figure out what would actually give me validation. What do I need to make myself feel contented? I realized that I'd been using work as a way to provide structure to my life, but I didn't deal with the fact that life isn't always structured, and it's messy, and uncertain things can happen, and chaos happens all the time, and you have to be able to deal with that. And it took bottoming them out completely, which in itself is chaos and uncertainty in a nutshell, to realize that. Other people learn the lesson a lot sooner and in a way healthier way, but I definitely didn't.
Yeah, my life went a similar route, really. Like there are many like realizations and kind of life lessons that I feel like my peers kind of came to, whereas I had to kind of like learn a lot of stuff by reaching rock bottom and like being in worse mental health in my life, and only then could I begin to make progress.
I agree with that. I think all of us that have struggled with our mental health, we didn't have the experiences in childhood to provide you with the confidence to deal with things when things go bad. I was talking to a friend about this a few weeks ago. She mentioned she'd had a fairly happy childhood. She was given stability, and so she always felt stable. So when something bad did happen later on, especially when she was an adult, it was like, oh, I know how to deal with this. This isn't the worst thing in the world. Things generally are always okay. But when you don't have that experience growing up, when you're bullied, you feel worthless about yourself, the people in authority can't give you that stability. When something bad happens to you when you're older, you freak out completely because you spiral, because you think the worst is going to happen, because there isn't a system in place that will catch you, even though that system should come from within. But you don't have it. Like you said, it's only by reaching rock bottom that you start to build those coping mechanisms. You start building those boundaries, those healthy connections that get you to where you should be. Because I bottomed out so utterly, the only way was up. And little by little, I started building myself up as a proper human being. I started practicing healthier boundaries. I talked to friends properly. Like, I opened up more. My wife's been so supportive. Like, through so much, I don't deserve her. And I took the time to figure out what I wanted from life, which I don't think I ever had done properly. And I don't think anyone who's had a mental health crisis has done themselves. We all learn this lesson at different points in life, like some of us later than others, but you have to figure out what makes you happy and stay true to that. And for me, that was being a bit of a tech geek. I was always interested in that. I'd done science at university. I was a geneticist originally. Like, I'd worked in the lab, but I'd gone off that and moved into more corporate pharmaceutical land. That was what my career was in, which had led me down that dark road. And it's a notorious industry for that. But I realized I enjoy technology, so why not try and learn to code and be a software engineer? I'd always wanted to look into that, but I always thought it was too late. And then bizarrely, while I was still being monitored by the mental health crisis team, a ad came up for a coding bootcamp, which was free. So I just took that as a sign, and I applied and managed to get through all the screening processes, and I got onto the course, which, considering my brain was still half fried and medicated, I was quite impressed I was able to do. So I took that as a further sign. And so I just jumped my previous career and jumped headfirst into retraining in tech. And just just coming up, I'll have been in my first software engineering job for a year, which is incredible because I haven't held down a job for a whole year for a very long time. So that's impressive. And I'm actually happy. I'm not on medication at the moment, and I am the happiest I've been for a very, very long time. But at the same time, I also only work. It doesn't take over my life, and I'm not using it as a crutch. to provide structure to my life. I do other things outside of work. Like, I've got into cosplay. I dress up as a Ghostbuster. I go to conventions. It's stupid. I could do circus, like aerial and acrobatics and things like that. That's something I always wanted to do, and I got into that. And so again, I feel like a bit more of a healthier, normal person. I've got hobbies and interests which lead to a rich and full life, which I didn't have before. I was just an empty vessel, just treading water and just existing and not dealing with the feelings, the uncertainty about life would give me, and realizing that's okay. I've realized now that it's like, things are uncertain. It's okay if they're uncertain, but in that uncertainty, there's opportunities. I never saw that before. I just saw everything as big and scary, and everything, that uncertainty would always turn out bad. I've realized that's not the case. Not everything turns out bad. There is good. I think finding validation from within is the most important thing anybody can do, regardless of if you've ever had mental health issues or not. That's the only thing that no one can take away from you. If you feel good in yourself, you'll pay that forward to other people. You'll make other people feel good about themselves, and good things will happen. People will want to be around you. Positive things will come into your life because you're being positive. You're trying to do the right thing and move forward. And you'll ultimately just have that inner sense of contentment. Recovery means to me always talking to someone. There is always someone who will listen. You're never really alone, regardless of how the world is and what narrative that is put out by the media and social media widely about how atomized we are as a society and as individuals. That's not the case. There are people that will always listen. There are friends out there. I've managed to make some really good friends over the last few years that I can rely on and can always talk to, and they will always be there for me. And if you don't think there is, that isn't true. There is always someone there.
You've been listening to Recovery from Anything. I'm your host, Abby Feltham. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review the show, and join the community on Instagram @RecoveryFromAnything. You can find out more about this week's storyteller or submit a story of your own on our website, recoveryfromanything.com. Thank you for listening.